Go ahead, Peter.
Thanks, Jen. Following up on Weech's question,
Yeah.
a lot of focus on the economic pain in Russia potentially from these sanctions. But what about the economic pain here? The Russians are saying they think gas prices in Europe are going to double. How high could they get here?
Well, I think, again, Peter, and as I said to Weija, I mean, some of this depends on what President Putin does. So as he is suggesting what the impact will be around the world, it's all based on what his actions are, just to be very clear about it. What the president is focused on and is working on is taking every step we can to communicate with, coordinate with, engage with big global suppliers around the world to minimize the impact on the energy markets.
But even without all this going on, gas in California is almost $5 a gallon. Should people across the country expect to see that kind of a number when they go to gas up their car? $5, $6?
Well, again, I think as you heard the president say last week, standing up for our values is not without cost. What we're trying to do is minimize that cost.
Got to pay for our values. Got to pay for our values. Got to pay for our values. According to Jen Psaki, gas has gone higher, up to $110 a barrel. Jen Psaki, got to pay for our values. Now, whose values are these? I keep asking that question because it's very clear that it's not everybody else's values. What's sad about this is basically what we're talking about, a small cadre of human beings with grandiose ideas of the world, their values. But they're not the ones that are paying for them. Jen Psaki is going to get a cozy job working on MSNBC. She's going to be making millions of dollars for basically a propaganda show for Democrats. Do you honestly believe that the spikes that we're seeing in prices are going to hit Psaki in the way that it's going to hit a single parent or the way it's going to hit a normal American family? The overwhelming majority of people in this country, I think it was like 60%, don't have $500 or $600 in the bank. Think about what I'm saying here. Those people got to pay for gas. Those people got to pay for food. Those people got to pay for rent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the policies that Joe Biden is taking is making that worse. It is making that worse. And to get that across that much more so, or that much more emphatically, the very people that voted for Democrats in mass and got nothing in return for that vote, I'm talking about blacks, are going to be decimated that much more because they're going to be hit that much harder by the economic hardship that is being created by the policies that Joe Biden is putting forth right now. I wanted to call this video Joe Biden whacks off to Ukraine as the American public gets decimated by the price hikes that he is causing. And Jen Psaki, she said it's all based on his actions. His, in this case, meaning Putin. No. It was the economic war, let's be very clear, that created these price hikes. At one point, Jen Psaki says, these are the Putin price hikes. Okay, so fair enough. You at the very least acknowledge and accept that the price hikes and the increasing in prices that we're seeing from the standpoint of oil, and of course, any increase in oil or gas spreads throughout the market because basically everything runs on energy. And so you accept that this war on some level is associated with these price hikes. Okay, did this war need to take place? Of course not. Whether you want to call it a failure of Western policy or fulfillment of Western policy, I guess it depends on the way you look at it, right? But all things being equal, the Yanukovych government in 2014, the U.S. didn't have to knock over the Yanukovych government, the duly elected government of Ukraine in 2014, elected by the Russian speaker or the ethnic Russians and by the Eastern or Western Ukrainians. Both elected a president. It was Biden using neo-Nazis as the tip of a spear in order to get rid of that government because that government wouldn't basically screw over the country and sign on to a deal with Europe. He called for a pause, and that was too much. All of a sudden, protests. All of a sudden, American politicians showing up, egging the protesters on. That much more. You get Victoria Luna on top of, let's midwife this thing. And they're choosing the various people who are going to be in the new client state of Ukraine once the coup government takes office. All right, so you didn't need to do that. That was a choice. That wasn't an act of God. And on top of that, they created all sorts of consequences in regards to, certain ethnic Russian regions not wanting to be under a Russophobic government. And more importantly than that, the moment that the government or the coup government took over, There was no legitimacy at all to that government. So in knocking over the duly elected Ukrainian government, you created all sorts of consequences for the other regions of Ukraine. Okay, fair enough. Even after the expansion of NATO, even after knocking over Ukraine, the Minsk II agreements, at this point, Ukraine is basically a client state. And as a client state, the United States has all sorts of influence in order to push them to fulfill the terms of the Minsk agreements. So just because the U.S. will say every so often, yeah, we believe they should do this, in real world terms, that was not something that the U.S. wanted. If the U.S. wanted, Joe Biden talked about how he held $1 billion over Ukraine's government's head in order to get them to fire a prosecutor. How is that not a client state? They were so weak and fledgling that Joe Biden, not even the president, a vice president, was able to basically hold money over their head in order to force and compel their behavior. If the U.S. wanted them to fulfill the Minsk Accords, or Minsk II, they would have done so. They didn't do it. Even after that, you get Putin saying in Moscow, we need security guarantees. We need security guarantees. This is an unacceptable situation. You cannot integrate Ukraine into NATO on our border. And considering the way the United States basically responded when the Soviet Union was putting weapons in Cuba, you would think that we would kind of get this notion of security concerns by missiles and mercenaries and various weapons from a militaristic organization being on the border aimed at your country. And that's after knocking over that particular government to even create that situation in the first place. None of that needed to take place. And even as Moscow pleaded, come to some security arrangements, what did the US and NATO say? Russia doesn't have security concerns. NATO is Levin light. Russia, Putin is just crazy. He has nothing to be concerned about. Nothing at all. As you look over the number of governments that the United States have either knocked over or, for that matter, militarily invaded in wars of aggression, are you honestly telling me, in rational human being, that Putin doesn't have concerns or security concerns? Of course he has security concerns. The entire point of NATO was to, well, basically go after the Soviet Union. But at the point where the Soviet Union collapsed, it remained and it expanded, and the target was always Russia. That is the truth. That is not an act of God. Those are acts of men that are making certain choices that have consequences to those choices. Don't believe me? What about William Burns? Niet means niet. That CIA director who is also apparently a Putin puppet. Look, right here. Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement in efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences which would seriously affect Russia's security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. William Burns. So when all of those people kept coming out saying, Putin is just doing this for no reason. He always wanted to get into Ukraine and blah, blah, blah. Well, apparently, William Burns didn't think so. Head of the CIA at this point. So yeah, I get it, right? There's all of the propaganda and all of the lying and everything else. This is the reality of events. Would the United States accept a situation where Moscow knocks over the Mexican government, installs a puppet government, a client state, and then integrates it in some kind of security arrangement where they're putting weapons and missiles and they're training mercenaries and they're training people just in case there's a war with the United States, and they're having these security things where they're pretending as if they're invading Florida? Would the United States accommodate that? Would it be okay with that? And considering we were willing to end the world because of missiles being in Cuba, I'm not going to take a lesson from these guys who can't be honest actors when they're talking about basically us getting closer and closer to oblivion. This is a proxy war. I don't even know how that's debatable at this point. The Secretary of Defense said the goal of this was to undermine and to basically degrade Russia as a military force or as a sovereign force. This document that Burns sent, this memo, was back in 2008. 2008. Nobody told NATO that they needed to offer Ukraine membership. And to be more on point, even after all of that, as Russia is saying we have real security concerns and everything else that William Burns owns up to. William Burns even owns up to that Russia didn't necessarily want to go in. Even after all of that, you get the situation with Zelensky coming out saying, hey, they told us that we would never be a part of NATO anyway. So at the exact same time that Russia is saying Ukraine cannot be a part of NATO, and Western leaders are saying, how dare you tell us your security concerns. Behind the scenes, all of them had basically accepted that they weren't going to be part of NATO. That's according to Zelensky. And Zelensky is God-man, right? So everything Zelensky says is love and light and truth. The point that I'm making here is this is one provocation after the next, even going back 40 years. When the Soviet Union fell and they made those agreements saying, hey, we're not going to move an inch to the east. Why? All of them understood that this was going to be a red line. That's why I say either the culmination of Western policy or the failure of Western policy. I am cynical enough to believe that this was intentional, that the very situation that William Burns is talking about was the very situation that they wanted to create. Otherwise, why did they take one step after the next towards that particular objective? Why? Are they incompetent? Or are they playing this just like Brzezinski did in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen basically dragging the Soviet Union into its own Vietnam? Here's the rub. This is not going according to plan. I've said it before. I'll say it again. The notion that you decide we're going to have an economic war after basically provoking a real legitimate war in Europe. And then in the economic war, the target of that war, currency, floats up. The amount of money that they're making from their main reserve, meaning gas, goes up. You get famine in various parts of the world because of the wheat and everything else. The point I'm making here is, whereas I suspect the Russian economy is going to take a hit, but it seems that they are on the road to recovery where we are on the road to ruin. Putin's approval rating has gone up to 80%. What is Biden's? What is Johnson's? For that matter, what is Schultz in Germany? All of these people are politically fraught situations with inflation eating away at their country. None of this was an act of God. All of this was from mendacious human beings with the media to basically carry those lies and to eliminate other sources of information that could bring these inconvenient truths up. It's worse than that. Well, this inflation, and to be very clear, what I mean by inflation. Before we even get to that, there is a potential, if you remember, going back in Turkey, where Zelensky, Ukraine, basically comes out and has peace talks. And as they're having these peace talks, Zelensky puts on the table one item after the next. We won't be part of NATO, the thing that Russia wanted in the first place. We would need security guarantees. Okay, there's that. The Donbass region and the other region wouldn't be associated within the context of those security guarantees. Okay, there's that. We're not going to have military on our soil, meaning if we do, we're going to have to get permission from Russia to do so. Meaning Ukraine, losing that conflict, comes out and starts putting out peace overtures. This comes out in Ukrainian press because if you remember, recently, those peace overtures no longer exist. According to Ukrainista Pravda, sources close to Zelensky, the Prime Minister of United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, who appeared in the capital almost without warning, brought two simple messages. The first is that Putin is a war criminal. He should be pressured, not negotiated with. And the second is that even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreements or guarantees with Putin, they are not, meaning the West, are not. Johnson's position was that the collective West, which back in February had suggested Zelensky should surrender and flee, now felt that Putin was not really as powerful as they had previously imagined, and that here was a chance to press him. 3 days after Johnson left for Britain, Putin went public and said talks with Ukraine had turned into a dead end. So let me get this straight. Not only is Biden and his gang of European idiots, basically gimp suits, are provoking a war, they're also preventing that war from coming to some level of a resolution, because as Western press owned up to, many of the people in NATO countries would rather bleed Russia white and is perfectly content in using Ukrainians as the weapon to do it. I mean, for God's sake, they had basically a Russophobic, Nazi-powered or neo-Nazi-powered military aimed and targeted. And these guys were being beefed up militarily at this point for several years at this point, as they were being closer and closer and more integrated into NATO. Again, something that all of them knew was a red line. After provoking a war, you now have the US and NATO nations preventing Zelensky from basically coming to some level of peace talks and terms. Okay, what is the effect of that beyond all of these Ukrainians that are basically getting killed and being killed? And again, in a losing war, regardless of the nonsense that you're getting in Western media about Russia is stalled, Russia tried to take Kiev, Russia is doing this, Russia is doing that. The reality of it is that even Western press at this point has to grudgingly admit that they are making progress. New York Times. The Russian Defense Ministry said Tuesday that its forces in eastern Ukraine had advanced to the border between Donetsk and Luhansk, the provinces where Moscow-backed separatists have been fighting Ukraine's army for 8 years. You mean where the Ukrainian military has been slaughtering other Ukrainians for the last 8 years? Yes, it's a civil war. That's exactly what a civil war is in the literal sense of the word. And yeah, for the longest time, Russia hadn't gotten involved. Russia did get involved when it became clear that these guys were basically going to have a massive attack. All of that time period where they're like, Russia's on the border. You know who was on the border? Ukrainian troops were on the border. Russia was like 100, 200 kilometers away. At the point where they started getting into position to move, we had Mark Sloboda on, and we told you, yes, they are now on the border, and they are now about to take action. Right here, let's keep going. Has been fighting right here. The assertion, if confirmed, strengthens the prospect that Russia could gain complete control over the region known as Donbass, compared with just a third of it before the February 24th invasion. If Russia can hold on to or expand the territory it occupies, the south and east, and maintain its domain in the Black Sea, it would further undermine Ukraine's already battered economy, improve Moscow's leverage in future negotiation settlements, and potentially expand its capacity to stage broader assaults. Yes, taking Mariupol was an objective. Land bridge to the Crimea. And I don't know if you've been paying attention to the reports that have been coming out of what's been taking place on the ground, but Russia has been making steady progress in chewing the Ukrainian military. Again, another objective, degrade and destroy the Ukrainian military with artillery. And so one side has been making progress. The other side has been making propaganda videos to show running a propaganda war. At some point, the propaganda gives way to reality as they are encircling large numbers of Ukrainian forces. And I guess my point in this is all of these leaders understand that this is a losing conflict. And despite it being a losing conflict, Biden continues to double down on policy of dumping more and more money. Ukraine is running low on manpower, not to mention vehicles. Why do you think they're pushing so hard to get that stuff there? Because those things are being destroyed or captured, for that matter. And I suspect at some point probably even sold out of corrupt ends. Secondary to the point, even the New York Times, that never has a good word for Russia, even when that good word is warranted, has to come out and own up to, okay, yeah, it seems like they're making progress. All right. But what are the effects of Biden taking this route? What are the effects? Well, we know that inflation, the GDP dropped 1.4%, even though New York Times says, hey, that's not as bad as we think. And more to the point, that inflation is the highest that it's been in the last 40 years, leading inexorably to a recession. We know that the Bank of England has said that that they're going to hit 10% inflation, and they're calling for a recession. And this is going to create all sorts of political instability in these various countries as they have to deal and grapple with that level of inflation, which is kind of the key point that I want to make here. At a time where COVID is still a thing, and they're expecting 100,000 new COVID cases over the fall, not just that, where inflation is eating into the salary, the income, the savings, and I'm not talking about the uber rich. I ain't talking about regular Americans. I look at this stuff through the lens of a person who was born or who was raised by a single parent, who never made more than $15 an hour. And any of this stuff would have been devastating. The idea that we would have had to pay twice as much for gas or twice as much for food is devastating. And that is not just a situation here in the United States, that is also in Europe, with the poor being the ones that are actually paying for their values. Right here. Biden says, I know Americans are hurting from inflation. Okay, you get it. But do you get it? Because again, here is another situation where people who are making decisions are insulated from the consequences of those decisions. In this case, the wealth of the world. Wealth in this case also being, Joe Biden and his crooked, corrupt family. So you have this situation where these guys are like, oh, I know inflation is hurting you. No, you don't. You don't get it. It doesn't hit you and cut you to the bone in the way that it does many people who are basically trying to make ends meet. And you are making their lives that much more miserable for this nonsense campaign where you're acting as if Ukraine is somehow a vital interest of the United States. It is not. And Psaki's saying you got to pay for our values. All right? All right? So these guys are going to send $40 billion to Ukraine. $40 billion. So at a time where inflation is eating through the U.S. population, especially the middle class and the poor, Biden decides that his best interest at this moment is to send $40 billion to Ukraine. Congressional leaders struck a deal on Monday to send $39.8 billion in military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine that could be taken up by the House as soon as Tuesday, Axios learned. The deal, which is billions more than the $33 billion, an ungodly, ridiculous number that Biden came up with himself, the White House initially requested, is slated for quick passage after Democrats agreed to drop a key priority: separating the Ukraine aid from roughly $10 billion in funding for the coronavirus pandemic. Republican leaders said they would block the Ukraine funds if they were linked to COVID-19 appropriations. So think of what that means. The United States government is going to send $40 billion, bam, out of nowhere. Just bam, $40 billion. That's on top of the billions that it's already sent to Ukraine, while simultaneously not paying for COVID money. They are expecting 100,000 COVID cases. The White House warning of a fall surge, plans for how to provide vaccines if there is no more COVID aid. So Ukraine gets $40 billion. The White House has been asking Congress for $22.5 billion in emergency aid to continue responding to the pandemic, but Republicans have insisted on a lower number. And Democrats have just agreed to separating these two things. So at the point where these two things are separated, how are they going to get it through the finish line? Can they still get it through the finish line if they're separated? An entire point of Republicans wanting it separated was so there will be nothing to compel them or push them to basically fall in line of that issue. Because again, the media space, one point of view. Other points of view have been eliminated. And now they're going to put in a ministry of truth in order to decimate the remaining points of view that is pointing out how loony and batshit crazy, not to mention dangerous, this policy is. You are 1 degree away from separation from another nuclear power nation. And this is after your media reports have been running with stories: U.S. intelligence helped kill Russians, Russian generals. U.S. intelligence helped kill Russian soldiers. U.S. intelligence helped sink the Moskva. Think of how insane that is. That is stuff that you used to have cloak and dagger. You are screaming us to the hilt in this triumphant way, as if your country is at war, which is indeed the problem. We are not at war. Ukraine is not a vital interest. I don't care what happens to Ukraine. The fact of the matter is, if the U.S. wasn't dicking around in Ukraine, none of this will be happening. If at any point belligerence wasn't the main policy that the U.S. and the West was going along with, whether that's powered by racism, whether that's powered by the Trump-Russia stuff, I don't know, but it has been utterly and entirely catastrophic from the standpoint of Ukraine. They're putting bullets and guns into the hands of children to go out there to send them to fight and die by Russians. Astonishing. So instead of dealing with this, something that Biden, again, even if it's tangentially acknowledges, is related to what is taking place from the standpoint of the economic war that he himself initiated after they basically provoked the conflict. Now he's sending them $40 billion more while the rest of this country suffers. It's not the 10% number. That number gets cherry picked when they say 10% inflation, 10% inflation. Fuel oil, 70%. Gas, 48%. This increase, inflation. Used cars, 35%. Hotels, 29%. Airfare, 24%. Utility gas, 22%. Bacon, 18%. Oranges, 18%. Furniture, 16%. Beef, 16%. New cars, 13%. Chicken, 13%. Milk, 13%. Appliances, 12%. Fish, 11%. Eggs, 11%. Coffee, 11%. Food at home, 10%. Rent, 4.5%. And that doesn't even really touch the fear that is in the population as it sees that inflation tick up, as it sees the rate hikes, which they know on some level means a decimation of jobs, because that's what rate hikes basically do. It cuts down the amount of money that's in the economy in order to bring down inflation. But by definition, if there's not that money flushing through the economy, then on some level that's going to affect economic output. On some level, that is kind of the point. When you ask the American public what they're thinking and feeling at this moment, they're freaked out. Most notably, the percentage of worried about maintaining their standard of living. Okay, this is a horrendous color. All right, a little bit better. Most notably, the percentage worried about maintaining their standard of living has increased 17 points among lower income adults from 56% in 2021 to 73% today. By contrast, it increased 6 points to 52% among middle income earners and 4 points among 36% among top income group. Similarly, the percentage of lower income adults worried about paying rent or mortgage, making the minimum credit card payments for retirement, and paying for medical care in the case of serious illness or accident have all increased by 10 or more points, compared with small or no increase among higher income adults. Again, why? They are insulated. So when Psaki's like, we got to pay for our values, it's not them. They're not worried about whether or not they can pay for their values. No, it is us that have to pay for values that we never espouse. And not just never espouse, never had a decision or choice in making. This is them. This is 40-year plan culminating into the events that are taking place right now. And we are basically taking a hit for it. Europe is taking a hit, but keep in mind, from the U.S. perspective, that's just gravy. All things being equal, if those gang of idiots, those gimp suit wearers, if they are going to go along with a president that is clearly mentally declining, clearly not altogether there, and they haven't learned their lesson from Syria and Iraq, then they earned it, right? I mean, all things being equal, Europe is being decimated. Europe gets 40% of its gas or something from Russia. I forget the amount of oil that it was basically getting from Russia. The European economy, Germany has basically said we can't do without gas. They're admitting that they're going to take an economic hit for issues of oil. And then you have this kind of weird situation where Poland is like, we're not using Russian gas. So instead, we're going to get it from Germany, and we're going to pay more money for it, emptying our coffers that much more. So a European Union that is supposed to be an economic union has basically made decisions and choices with the sanctions that it was passing after provoking a war that is decimating the economy to which it is supposed to be ushering and maintaining. This is astonishing on so many levels. Not just from the standpoint of, but from the standpoint of what Biden is doing and how that policy is adversely affecting this country, and even still continues to dig the ditch with sending $40 billion more to keep this war going that much longer. It is astonishing. Utterly astonishing. And to make that point that much more clear, right here. This should have got far more press. Lend-Lease bill. We've instigated ourselves into a civil war. We are basically in a proxy war now with Russia. And you can even say a direct war. I mean, I don't even know how you can call it a proxy, since we're supplying weapons, money, training, materials, etc., etc., etc. We are funding the war effort against the Russians. So there's that. You even get Thomas Friedman coming out, who said this. Basically what I've been saying for the last several weeks. This is Friedman. that Putin puppet from the New York Times columnist. At the same time, from everything I have been able to glean from senior U.S. officials who spoke to me on condition of anonymity, the leaks were not part of any thought-out strategy, and Biden was livid about them. I'm told that he called the Director of National Intelligence and the Director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense to make it clear in the strongest, most colorful language that this kind of loose talk is reckless, has to stop immediately before we end up in an unintended war in Russia. All right, let's put a pin in that for a moment. This is what I mean. He's dementia riddled. I can't believe he's this stupid. The staggering takeaways from the leaks is that they suggest we are no longer in an indirect war with Russia, but rather are edging towards a direct war. And no one has prepared the American people or Congress for that. To show how comically ridiculous Biden is, does Biden honestly believe that the Russians don't know that they're Americans on the ground in Ukraine? Or for that matter, that they weren't given intelligence, or for that matter, that the $40 billion wasn't going to be used to kill Russians? Is he that comically unaware where he doesn't know that? I suspect his issue is that it's a face-saving issue. That the moment that you announce something like that, it forces Putin and Russian leaders around him to do something about that. It's an issue of face. And these guys have been out there putting out so much propaganda that they also start putting out triumphantly on how much they were helping Ukraine kill Russians. Surely there's no consequence to that at all. What Thomas Friedman is recognizing, hey, this seems problematic. This could radically escalate. And it could radically escalate in a way where the president has wrapped in so much political capital into something that in no way should be a priority of the United States, that he has no capacity or even good sense to step from the brink. Do we know that Biden, at the point where Ukraine loses this war, which they will lose, and when they collapse, and when their forces are encircled, and they're either going to be annihilated or captured, is Biden going to be able to back away and accept the fact that all of the political capital that he invested in Ukraine was basically for naught as they lose miserably? Look, you can put out all the propaganda you want to the home front. And this argument that these guys were putting out propaganda or information warfare stuff with the notion in order to confuse Putin. Think about it. Is Putin unaware that you're lying when he is looking at what is going on the ground militarily? The only reason they were putting out that information, those lies, was for home consumption. That would be the only people that would ever consume that and believe it as real. They say, hey, Ukraine said this? Okay, they're just going to say it. They're going to report it. Is it true? Of course not. Most of the time it's not true. And yet, this is where we are with the media that is compliant and that basically are stenographers for whatever the United States government says. And so, if that's the situation that you're presented with, where real, factual, contextual information can't necessarily break through to call into question what these guys are doing and the ramifications of what they're doing, that is a dark place to be in. And what Thomas Friedman is sensing is, this seems to be dicey. We are dancing on the edge of oblivion. And it doesn't seem that they're backing away from it. Lend-Lease was the plan that preceded the war, the Second World War. That's what Lend-Lease is. Now, yes, Hitler declared war on the United States, but understand why. He declared war on the United States because he understood that the United States was basically funding the war effort for Britain, and eventually it was getting weapons around to the Soviet Union also. But the U.S. at that point became the world's supplier of weaponry for that war. And at the point where Pearl Harbor was hit, Hitler jumped the gun, yes. FDR probably couldn't necessarily declare it immediately. That's true. But the war that he declared wasn't against Germany. It was against Japan. Hitler jumped the gun. But Hitler jumped the gun because he understood that the United States was basically arming the people that he was fighting. Look, this is disastrous. And if you get a chill down your spine thinking to yourself that, oh my God, this incompetent man that has failed at everything that he has put his hands on in this particular term, it has only been, 2 years? It's only been 2 years. Failed at everything, whether it was Afghanistan, whether it was COVID, whether it was on issues of inflation and supply chain leaks. You pick an item, he basically failed on it. And now he is the one that is basically leading the gang of gimps in Europe and the vassal states of Europe, for that matter, into this economic war that doesn't seem to have an end, and simultaneously preventing any level of peace overtures to take place, to put an end to it with some kind of peace talks. Your president, ladies and gentlemen. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. We have, what is it, Tony Clifton. Thank you, Tony. I appreciate that. All right, guys. You'll have a good one. Be back in a few.